What if the woman they mocked in a Walmart parking lot was never just a woman at all? The fluorescent lights hummed above her like indifferent witnesses. The November air in Wilmington carried that thin coastal chill that creeps under jackets and into bones. Catherine Sullivan moved slowly, deliberately, loading groceries into the bed of a rusted Ford F-150. Jeans, faded sweater, blonde hair tied back in a simple ponytail. Ordinary. That was the point. 3 years of being invisible. 3 years of pretending her hands didn't remember how to kill. 3 years of trying to live with the echo of 8 gunshots in a Syrian courtyard that should have been her last. She heard them before she saw them. Laughter, male, drunk, the kind of laughter that comes from never being told no. Stay right there. The words cut across the parking lot. Her pulse didn't change. 62 beats per minute, the same rhythm she'd held while lining up a 1,000-yard shot in Helmand. They surrounded her, big, confident, filming. When the largest one grabbed her ponytail and yanked, pain snapped through her scalp. And something older than pain answered. In 3 seconds, the first one was on the ground, wrist shattered, nose broken. In 7, the second was bleeding against a Honda Civic. In 11, the third was deleting a video with shaking hands. She walked away. But the world didn't. By dawn, the footage had 20 million views. Tiny Blonde destroys 3 massive men. Comment sections turned into speculation threads. Former Marine, Ranger, SEAL. Somebody would recognize the movement, the economy, the violence contained inside stillness. Somebody always does. At 2:30 a.m., a knock came at her truck window. Master Chief Mike Delaney stood there, older now, silver hair sharp against the dark. "You lasted longer than I expected, Katie," he said softly, "but they know you're alive." She had spent 3 years trying to forget Syria, trying not to replay the moment her team walked into an ambush that only someone on the inside could have orchestrated. She had survived. They had not. Ignored by her own command, quietly buried under a classified failure, officially dead. "Your father didn't die the way they told you," Mike said across her kitchen table hours later. Her father, Captain Patrick Sullivan, killed in Grenada before she was born. Shot in the back. By someone on his own team. The name landed like a detonation. Vanessa Cortland, now Vanessa Blackwood, Deputy Director of Operations, CIA. The same woman who had overseen Catherine's last mission in Syria. The same woman who signed off on the op that got 8 SEALs killed. The trailer felt too small to hold that kind of betrayal. Then the black SUV appeared outside. The CIA didn't knock politely. They offered a mission. Crimea, a Russian defector claiming to have evidence of a Cold War sleeper program called Ghost Directive, embedded agents inside U.S. military leadership, active, waiting. He would only speak to her. Because of her father. It smelled like a trap, it felt like a trap. But it also felt like truth. And Catherine Sullivan had spent her entire life chasing the shadow of a truth that killed every Sullivan who touched it. So she said yes. The jump over the Black Sea came under a moonless sky, high-altitude insertion, oxygen thin, wind vicious. Mike jumped beside her despite cracked ribs and 71 years of gravity tugging at old scars. Grace Remington from the SAS, Bridget Ali from Navy Intelligence, 3 women and 1 aging Master Chief gliding through freezing darkness toward hostile ground. This wasn't heroics. It was quiet suffering, numb fingers, burning lungs, 45 minutes under canopy praying no radar caught their silhouette. They landed clean. They were already too late. The defector lay dead in his apartment, a bullet in his forehead, but he'd hidden something, a microSD card inside his sock. On that card was proof. Ghost Directive wasn't rumor, it was architecture, 37 sleeper agents placed in American institutions, activated in silence, protected by chaos. Vanessa Blackwood's codename glowed on the screen. Winter Hawk. Recruited by the KGB in 1979. She killed Patrick Sullivan in 1983. She staged Brennan Sullivan's car crash in Berlin in 1989. She leaked Catherine's Syria mission in 2021. 3 generations erased by the same hand. Catherine didn't cry. She went very still. Then came the final file. Winter Ghost. Arlington National Cemetery. Veterans Day. A drone swarm packed with explosives targeting military leadership, president, joint chiefs, 280 projected casualties, blamed on domestic extremism. And Catherine herself framed as the mastermind. 67 hours. That was the clock. Vanessa even sent a video, calm, elegant, confession wrapped in arrogance. "You can't stop it," she said. "Your father couldn't, your grandfather couldn't, you won't." There it was. The weight Catherine had carried since childhood, the unspoken fear she had never voiced. What if she wasn't enough? Ignored by superiors, branded unstable, officially dead, now hunted by her own agency. Broken. And yet, she looked at Mike, at Grace, at Bridget. None of them walked away. Not because they believed it would be easy, but because walking away would mean letting ghosts win. They re-entered the United States without clearance, without sanction, without backup. Just 4 people against a 45-year conspiracy. Inside Mike's compound in the Outer Banks, Catherine held her grandfather's old 1911, steel worn smooth by war and time. "I'm ready," she whispered. "Not to avenge. To finish." They mapped Arlington, studied patrol patterns, identified potential drone launch corridors. 24 hours until detonation. Sleep became irrelevant, food mechanical, fear compartmentalized. At some point, Catherine stood alone outside, pine trees swaying in cold wind. She thought about the men in Syria, how she'd felt when the first bullet struck and she realized they'd been betrayed, the guilt of surviving, the shame of living when better men had not. She had run for 3 years, not because she was afraid of dying, because she was afraid of failing again. That was the real enemy. Vanessa believed history repeated itself. But history also evolves. The night before Veterans Day, Catherine loaded her weapon and looked at her team. No speeches. No grand promises. Just a quiet truth. "We stand watch," she said. Her father stood watch in Grenada. Her grandfather stood watch in Berlin. Her team stood watch in Syria. Now it was her turn. Not for revenge. For dignity. Because strength isn't loud. It doesn't posture in parking lots. It doesn't boast in viral videos. It waits. It absorbs. It endures. And when the moment comes, it acts. The sun would rise over Arlington soon. Politicians would speak. Families would mourn. Flags would wave. And somewhere in that sacred space, 4 hunted Americans would move through shadows to stop a war that most people would never know almost happened. Catherine Sullivan wasn't a legend. She was a daughter who wanted the truth. A soldier who refused to let betrayal be the final chapter. A woman who had been pulled by the hair in a parking lot and reminded that some instincts never die. Vanessa Blackwood believed she had engineered the perfect ending. She forgot something. Sullivans don't run. They finish. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the explosion come before the ceremony even started? At 8:47 a.m., smoke rose from a maintenance building tucked behind rows of white headstones at Arlington. Most of the crowd assumed it was a generator malfunction, A small accident, nothing that could possibly matter on a day meant for honor and silence. But Catherine Sullivan knew better. She was already moving. The fake Arlington maintenance badge clipped to her jacket felt heavier than body armor ever had. Grace Remington walked 10 paces behind her, posture relaxed, eyes anything but. Around them, veterans adjusted medals on navy blue coats. Families held folded programs against the cold. A military band warmed brass instruments in soft bursts of sound. It looked peaceful. It was anything but. Inside the maintenance building minutes earlier, 100 modified drones had been arranged in precise rows like mechanical coffins waiting for instructions. Each carried enough C4 to shred flesh within a 10-foot radius. The laptop controlling them displayed a countdown timer that would have ended at 10:30 a.m., exactly during the 21-gun salute. Exactly when the most powerful military leaders in the United States would be standing still. Catherine's hands had hovered over the keyboard, scanning for override codes inside the stolen Ghost Directive Archive. The abort code, October 25, 1983, the day her father died. A signature. A taunt. She entered it without hesitation. The drones powered down. For one breath she'd felt relief. Then the self-destruct protocol activated. 60 seconds. She and Grace barely cleared the blast radius before the building's windows shattered outward. The explosion wasn't catastrophic, but it was loud enough to draw security. And loud enough to signal to someone watching remotely that their primary strike had failed. Now weaving through the growing crowd, Catherine felt the shift in atmosphere. Radios crackled, Secret Service agents repositioned, the perimeter tightened. Vanessa would know. Vanessa would adapt. That was the real danger. Catherine's earpiece crackled. Bridget's voice came through, tight but steady. Local police intercepted the secondary van. 50 more drones. They think it's a bomb threat tip. They don't know what they've actually stopped. Good, Catherine murmured. Keep monitoring chatter. She could see the VIP section ahead now. Black coats, polished shoes, discreet earpieces, the architecture of power arranged in neat rows. And there she was. Vanessa Blackwood. Composed, elegant. A deputy director of the CIA attending a ceremony honoring the fallen. Her posture was immaculate, chin lifted slightly as if she owned the ground beneath her feet. Catherine felt something twist low in her chest, not rage exactly. Recognition. This was the woman who had overseen her promotion, approved her missions, signed condolence letters to families whose sons she had knowingly sent into compromised operations. The betrayal wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, administrative, surgical. Like all real evil. The ceremony began at 10:00 a.m. A hush fell across thousands of people. The honor guard marched with precise cadence. Flags rippled in the breeze. The tomb of the unknown soldier gleamed white under a pale sky. Catherine stood among strangers and felt very small. This place wasn't abstract to her. 8 of her teammates had been buried under identical white stones. She knew how the folded flags felt in your hands. She knew the hollow ache after the final rifle volley. She also knew how easily today could have become another row of graves. At 10:15, the wreath was placed. At 10:29, the crowd rose for the salute. This was the moment Winter Ghost had been designed for. Catherine's breathing slowed. Her fingers brushed the grip of her grandfather's 1911 beneath her coat. 10 seconds. 9. 8. Nothing happened. No swarm rising from behind the maintenance building. No synchronized detonation over the VIP section. No mass casualty event to fracture the chain of command. The rifles fired their ceremonial blanks. Echoes rolled across the cemetery like distant thunder. The crowd remained standing. Alive. Across the lawn, Vanessa's composure cracked. It was subtle, a flicker in her eyes, a tightening of her jaw. She reached into her purse, pulling out a phone, checked it, checked again. No confirmation signal. No launch telemetry. The plan had failed. Vanessa stood abruptly, moving toward the aisle. Running. Catherine felt adrenaline surge, but her steps were controlled. Panic would only draw attention. She began cutting diagonally through the crowd, murmuring apologies as she passed. "Mike," she whispered into her mic. "I see her," came the reply. His voice sounded older than usual, tired but steady. "She's heading toward the east exit." Vanessa's security detail tightened around her, unsure what was wrong but sensing urgency. Catherine closed distance. 20 yards. 15. That's when their eyes met. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no dramatic music swelling. Just eye contact. Vanessa knew. And in that split second, something cold and calculating replaced the frustration on her face. If she couldn't detonate remotely, she would improvise. Vanessa's hand slid into her coat. Catherine saw the micro-movement, shoulder dip, elbow angle, the body language of someone drawing a concealed weapon. Time didn't slow. Training accelerated. 10 yards. The Secretary of Defense stood less than 12 feet from Vanessa, temporarily exposed while Secret Service adjusted positions. Vanessa's hand emerged holding a Walther PPK. Compact, efficient, historic. The kind of weapon that kills quietly and changes history loudly. Catherine drew. Her grandfather's 1911 cleared leather in one smooth motion. No two-handed stance. No time for a textbook sight picture. Just alignment. Breath. Pressure. She fired once. The .45 round struck Vanessa's shoulder, spinning her sideways. The Walther discharged upward into open air. For half a heartbeat, there was silence. Then chaos erupted. Secret Service agents tackled Vanessa to the ground. Others swarmed Catherine before she could lower her weapon. She didn't resist. Face pressed into cold grass, wrists wrenched behind her back. The smell of earth filled her lungs. Oddly, she felt calm. Because the worst had already been prevented. "Federal operator," she shouted. "CIA counterintelligence, that woman is a hostile foreign asset." Knees dug into her back, cuffs tightened. Then a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Stand down." Alexander Cordell appeared, credentials flashing. Orders barked with authority sharp enough to slice confusion in half. Catherine was hauled upright, uncuffed but held firmly. Vanessa lay on the ground 20 feet away, blood staining her coat but eyes still burning with fury. Even wounded, she radiated defiance. FBI agents converged. Radios exploded with chatter. The president was escorted away. The crowd was evacuated in controlled waves. Vanessa laughed through clenched teeth as she was pulled to her feet. "You think you've won?" she asked, blood on her lips. "You've delayed the inevitable." Catherine stepped closer. "You murdered my father." "Yes." No hesitation. "You murdered my grandfather." "Yes." "And my team." Vanessa's eyes gleamed. "You were collateral that refused to die." There was no remorse, no regret, only professional pride. "You forged me," Vanessa continued quietly. "Every mission you ran I approved. Every skill you honed I cultivated. You are the weapon I built." Catherine felt the old wound reopen, the fear that her strength had been engineered by the very person she hated. But then she remembered something her father had once written in a letter she kept folded in her footlocker. "Character isn't what they make you. It's what you choose when they try." "You didn't build me," Catherine said. "You tried to break me." FBI agents secured Vanessa fully. Cordell began issuing rapid orders to detain the other identified sleeper agents Bridget had flagged. The Ghost Directive Network began collapsing in real time. Vanessa's smile faded as realization set in. It wasn't just the drones that had failed. It was 45 years of hidden architecture crumbling. As she was led away, she looked back once more. "I hope you're ready for what comes next," she said softly, "because networks like this don't die quietly." Maybe she was right. Maybe somewhere, another cell was already recalibrating. But in that moment, under the pale November sky, 280 lives had not been erased. History had not been rewritten in smoke and blood. And Catherine Sullivan stood breathing. She watched as Vanessa was placed into a federal vehicle, doors slamming shut. Mike approached slowly, cane tapping against stone. "You good?" he asked. Catherine exhaled. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought I'd feel something." "You stopped a war inside a cemetery," he said gently. "Sometimes the feeling comes later." She looked out across the rows of white headstones. Ignored for 3 years. Branded unstable. Declared dead. And yet here she was, standing between betrayal and catastrophe. Not because she was invincible, but because she refused to run again. The wind shifted, carrying distant echoes of the ceremony that had resumed in quieter form. A bugle began to play taps. The notes drifted across the grass, fragile and resolute. Catherine closed her eyes. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired. But beneath the exhaustion was something else. Hope. Because this time, when evil reached for history, someone had been standing watch. What happens after you stop a war no one knows almost began. 2 weeks later, Catherine stood alone in a briefing room at Langley that smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. No applause, no cameras, no medals being pinned under flashbulbs. Just fluorescent lighting and a classified debrief that would never make the news. Across the table sat men and women who had once signed off on her intelligence failure in Syria. The same officials who let her take the quiet fall when 8 SEALs came home in flag-draped coffins. Now they avoided her eyes. Vanessa Blackwood was in federal custody. 45 years of espionage unraveling in sealed indictments. 17 sleeper agents arrested across NATO countries within days of Arlington. More still being hunted. Ghost Directive wasn't just exposed. It was bleeding out. But victory didn't feel the way she imagined it would. "You saved over 300 lives," Cordell said carefully, hands folded on the table. "The president asked that I personally extend his." "I didn't do it for him," Catherine interrupted softly. Silence. She hadn't meant it to sound sharp, but it came out that way. Because this wasn't about gratitude, it was about truth. Mike waited outside the room, leaning on his cane, pretending to read an outdated magazine. His ribs were still healing. Doctors said he should have been in a hospital bed. Instead, he was exactly where he'd always been when it mattered. Near her. The debrief stretched for hours. Timelines, communications, who knew what and when. How Vanessa maneuvered inside the CIA for decades without being fully detected. Catherine answered with precision, clinical professional. But underneath it all was something harder to explain. She had built her identity around proving herself, proving she deserved the trident, proving she wasn't just the daughter of a war hero. Now she knew something devastating. Her entire career had unfolded under the approval of the woman who murdered her father. Every promotion, every commendation. Signed by Winterhawk. That knowledge didn't feel empowering. It felt contaminated. When the debrief ended, Cordell walked her toward the exit. "There's something else," he said, "off the record." She stopped. "We're forming a new task unit," he continued. Multinational counter-sleeper operations, Cold War residue, you'd lead it. She almost laughed. Why me? Because you understand the psychology, he replied. Because you've lived the damage, and because when you had every reason to disappear, you stood your ground. Ignored, broken, haunted, and still standing. That wasn't something you could teach in training. Outside, the Virginia sky was gray and low, winter pressing in. Mike looked up when she stepped out. Well, he asked. They want me back. He nodded once, like he'd expected it. And Catherine didn't answer immediately. She stared at the parking lot, at the black sedans, at the American flag rippling above Langley's entrance. I don't know who I am without the fight, she admitted quietly. Mike's eyes softened. Kid, he said, you were somebody long before any fight found you. That hit deeper than any bullet ever had. Because for 3 years she'd lived like a ghost, convinced that surviving Syria meant she had failed. Convinced that if she'd been sharper, faster, smarter, 8 men would still be alive. She had carried that weight alone. Even after Arlington. Even after exposing Vanessa. The dead don't come back because you win. That's the part no one puts in the speeches. That night, she drove to Arlington by herself. No media, no ceremony. Just cold wind sweeping across rows of white stones. She stopped at 3 graves. Captain Patrick Sullivan, Colonel Brennan Sullivan, and 8 fresh markers bearing the names of SEAL Team 5. She knelt. I finished it, she whispered. Not triumphantly. Just matter of fact. The truth was out. The network dismantled. Vanessa facing life in a supermax cell where silence would be her only companion. But revenge hadn't healed her. It had only closed a chapter. For the first time, Catherine allowed herself to feel something she'd buried beneath discipline and mission planning. Grief. Raw, unfiltered. She cried quietly in the dark, shoulders shaking, not because she was weak, but because she had been strong for too long. Strength isn't the absence of tears. It's choosing not to drown in them. The next morning, she met Grace and Bridget at a quiet cafe near the Potomac. Grace wore civilian clothes now, though she carried herself like a soldier who'd never truly stand down. Bridget looked older somehow. Promotion to chief petty officer did that to you overnight. You taking it? Bridget asked. The unit, Catherine stirred her coffee slowly. I don't want to spend my life chasing ghosts. Grace studied her. Then don't chase ghosts, she said evenly. Build something that prevents them. It was simple. But simplicity has power. Catherine realized something in that moment. Her father and grandfather had died trying to uncover a conspiracy. She had survived because she'd learned from their mistakes. The mission wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about prevention. About ensuring no daughter would kneel at a headstone wondering who betrayed her father. Weeks passed. Vanessa's trial began under heavy classification, portions sealed, portions public enough to reassure the nation that something had been stopped. Catherine refused to attend. Not because she was afraid. Because Vanessa didn't get her presence anymore. Instead, she returned to Mike's compound in the Outer Banks. Pine trees, salt air, the familiar smell of gun oil and ocean wind. She walked through the training yard where she'd first learned leverage over strength, where Mike had taught her that size didn't matter if your foundation was solid. She picked up her grandfather's 1911 and ran drills until her hands steadied. Not to prepare for war. To remind herself she still owned her skill. Later that evening, sitting on the wooden porch with Mike, she finally answered Cordell's offer. I'll do it, she said. Mike didn't smile wide, he never did. He just nodded. Then do it your way. And that was the difference. For years, She'd been operating inside someone else's shadow. Her father's legacy, Vanessa's manipulation, the CIA's silence. Now she would build something defined by her own ethics. A unit that investigated without burying truth. A team that protected without sacrificing its own. Redemption isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It grows quietly in the decisions you make after the battle ends. Months later, Catherine stood inside a small operations center, walls lined with screens tracking chatter across continents. Grace worked liaison with British intelligence. Bridget ran cyberanalysis with precision that bordered on genius. The new unit had a name. Sentinel. Not hunters. Watchers. Because sometimes the greatest act of strength is simply standing guard, so others don't have to fight. Catherine looked around at her team and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not anger. Not guilt. Pride. Earned. Grounded. Human. That night she drove back to Wilmington. The Walmart parking lot was quiet. Same fluorescent lights. Same cold air. She stood where Brock Hadley had grabbed her hair months earlier. She didn't feel rage. She felt distance. Because that moment hadn't been about dominance. It had been about reclaiming herself. A woman can be gentle and lethal. Quiet and unbreakable. Haunted and hopeful. They are not contradictions. They are layers. Catherine turned toward her truck, hands in her jacket pockets, wind lifting her hair slightly. Somewhere in a federal prison, Vanessa Blackwood would spend the rest of her life replaying the moment she underestimated a daughter. And somewhere else, a young recruit would lace up boots unaware that a war had almost erased their leadership before they even served. That's the thing about guardians. If they do their job well, no one ever knows how close the darkness came. Catherine started the engine. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't living in anyone's shadow. She was standing watch. And sometimes, strength isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about being the last one still standing when the noise fades. How do you hunt a shadow that already knows your name? 6 months after Arlington, Sentinel received its first red flag anomaly at 0213. Not a drone swarm, not an assassination attempt. A financial ripple. Bridget's screens glowed pale blue inside the compact operations center outside Langley. Lines of code scrolled like falling rain. Offshore transfers, small, deliberate, spaced weeks apart, moving through shell charities tied to Cold War-era foundations long thought dormant. "Tell me I'm paranoid," Bridget muttered. Catherine stepped behind her, arms folded. "You're never paranoid at 2 in the morning," she replied quietly. "You're usually right." The money wasn't massive. That was the genius of it. Millions draw headlines. Thousands build networks quietly. Grace leaned against the far desk, scanning a parallel feed from British intelligence. "It's patterned," Grace said. "Every transaction aligns with diplomatic travel schedules." Catherine's pulse slowed, not with fear but with focus. Vanessa had warned her. Networks like this don't die quietly. They fracture. They adapt. They wait. "Source?" Catherine asked. Bridget tapped a key. Primary routing hub, Tallinn. Estonia. A NATO member with deep cyber history and old Soviet scars still embedded in architecture. Catherine nodded once. "Book it." Tallinn in winter felt like a city carved from ice and memory. Medieval towers stood beside glass tech hubs. Snow-lined cobblestone streets like powdered sugar over stone. Sentinel operated under diplomatic cover, liaison auditors reviewing joint cybersecurity initiatives, official enough to move, quiet enough to avoid attention. but someone was already watching. Catherine felt it the moment they landed. Not eyes specifically. Pressure, like stepping into a room where a conversation had just stopped. Their Estonian contact, Director Anu Veskimägi, met them inside a secured cyber operations wing. "You're looking for ghosts," Anu said bluntly, accent sharp and efficient. "We have many." Catherine appreciated the honesty. "We're not chasing nostalgia," she replied. "We're tracing funding." Bridget projected the financial map onto a wall display, thin glowing lines branching like veins across Europe. Anu's jaw tightened. This foundation dissolved in 1992. "On paper," Bridget corrected. Grace crossed her arms. "Someone reactivated it through shell NGOs, same signature encryption Vanessa used." Silence filled the room. Vanessa was still in federal prison in Colorado. No communication privileges beyond monitored legal counsel. Yet her fingerprint lingered. Catherine studied the projection. "Who had access to her external channels?" she asked. Anu hesitated. "During her first month in custody," she admitted, "there was a temporary transfer request for psychological evaluation. External contractor." Catherine felt something click into place. "Name?" Anu tapped her tablet. "Dr. Mikhail Rudenko." The room cooled instantly. Former KGB psychological operations specialist, defected in the early 2000s, consultant across NATO intelligence reform programs. Clean record. Decorated reputation. Exactly the kind of man who could reactivate a network without firing a shot. Grace exhaled slowly. "He evaluated Vanessa." "For 6 hours," Anu confirmed. 6 hours was an eternity for two trained operatives fluent in subtext. Catherine's mind moved fast. Vanessa didn't need a phone. She needed a messenger. They found Rudenko's office overlooking the Baltic Sea. Minimalist, sterile, curated intellectualism lining the shelves. He welcomed them with polite surprise. "Sentinel," he said smoothly, "I've heard impressive things." Catherine didn't sit. "You evaluated Vanessa Blackwood." "Yes," he replied calmly, "standard risk assessment." 6 hours is extensive." He smiled faintly. "Trauma processing is complex." Grace's gaze never left his hands. "No recording devices were found in the evaluation room," Rudenko continued. "Your implication is inefficient." Bridget stepped forward. "Financial conduits tied to defunct Soviet-era assets, reactivated 2 weeks after your session." Coincidence hung in the air like smoke. Rudenko adjusted his glasses. "You assume correlation equals causation." Catherine stepped closer now. "Vanessa believes in legacy," she said evenly. "In planting seeds that bloom decades later. If she couldn't detonate Arlington, she'd pivot." Rudenko's composure didn't break. But it thinned. "You're intelligent, Agent Sullivan," he said quietly. "But intelligence agencies suffer from a common delusion." "And what's that?" "That removing a leader ends an ideology." There it was. Not denial. Deflection. Grace moved first. Rudenko's wrist was pinned to the desk before he could reach the small transmitter hidden beneath his keyboard. Bridget ripped the device free, microburst encryption beacon. "Active." Catherine's stomach tightened. "How long?" she demanded. Rudenko smiled again. "You're already late." Across the city, a NATO data vault processed encrypted defense coordination protocols between 5 allied nations. At 14:42, an anomaly triggered inside its cooling core. Not an explosion. A thermal spike. Silent. Controlled. Within minutes, cascading server failures began isolating defense satellite uplinks. Not destroying them. blinding them. Temporary blindness in modern warfare is often more devastating than bombs. Catherine sprinted down icy streets with Grace and Bridget close behind, Estonian rapid response units flooding intersections. "You don't need to destroy infrastructure," Catherine shouted over sirens. "You just need to disrupt trust. Because when allies can't see, they hesitate. When they hesitate, they fracture." Rudenko wasn't after bodies. He was after doubt. They breached the vault facility amid emergency lockdown. Bridget slid into a terminal while engineers scrambled around her. "It's a logic worm," she muttered. "Not malware, behavioral code designed to trigger fail-safes." Translation, Grace snapped. "It convinces the system it's compromised, so it shuts itself down." Catherine scanned the room. Rudenko had built a psychological attack for machines. "Brilliant. Twisted. Can you reverse it?" Bridget's fingers flew. "Maybe, but I need time. You have 4 minutes before satellite blackout cascades west," Anu warned through comms. Catherine closed her eyes for half a breath. Vanessa's voice echoed in memory. "You are the weapon I built." No. She was. She was the countermeasure. "Bridget," Catherine said calmly, "don't fight the worm, validate it." "What?" "Give the system proof it's secure." Grace blinked. "You're suggesting." "Psych ops," Catherine finished, "for code." Bridget's eyes widened. "Override authentication using triple source verification," Catherine continued. "Feed it live hardware diagnostics plus manual confirmation from 3 allied nodes. It'll recognize the pattern as legitimate authority." Bridget moved instantly. Outside, snow whipped sideways as if the city itself held its breath. 3 minutes. 2. Satellite feeds flickered across wall monitors. One by one, uplinks stabilized. Cooling systems recalibrated. The vault lights steadied. Bridget exhaled sharply. "We're back." Across town, Rudenko was being transported in restraints. He didn't struggle. He looked almost satisfied. "You adapt quickly," he told Catherine as she faced him one last time before extradition. "You underestimated something," she replied. "And what is that?" "We're not cleaning up Cold War debris," she said. "We're evolving past it." His smile faltered for the first time. "Because evolution is unpredictable." That night, back at their temporary operations suite, Grace poured 3 glasses of Estonian von Italen liqueur. "A toast," Grace said quietly, "to not being blind." They clinked glasses. But Catherine didn't feel celebratory. She stood by the window, overlooking the frozen Baltic Sea. Vanessa had built a doctrine around invisibility. Rudenko weaponized doubt. This wasn't about nations anymore. It was about perception. Truth versus manipulation. And the battlefield wasn't always physical. Bridget approached softly. "You're thinking 5 moves ahead again." "I'm thinking about scale," Catherine admitted. "If this is what one evaluation session produced." Grace joined them. "Then we make sure the next session never happens." Catherine nodded. Sentinel wasn't just reacting anymore. They were anticipating. Building psychological resilience into alliances. Training systems and people to recognize manipulation before it metastasized. Because wars of the future wouldn't always be loud. Sometimes they'd whisper. And someone had to hear it first. As snow fell over Talon's ancient rooftops, Catherine allowed herself a rare, quiet certainty. Vanessa's generation believed power came from controlling narratives in the dark. Catherine's generation understood something different. Light travels faster. And she intended to keep it that way. What if the next war doesn't begin with an explosion, but with a lie so convincing it feels like truth. 9 months after Talon, Sentinel's operations center pulsed with quiet tension. No sirens, no gunfire, just screens, dozens of them. Bridget stood frozen in front of a wall-sized display, showing simultaneous breaking news alerts across 5 continents. A U.S. destroyer had allegedly fired on a Turkish patrol vessel in the Mediterranean. Video footage was already viral. Flames screaming in Turkish, a U.S. flag visible through smoke. Grace swore under her breath, "That's a NATO fracture event." Catherine didn't respond immediately. She was studying the footage frame by frame. The angle was wrong. The shadow of the sun didn't align with the reported coordinates. And the audio, there was a half-second echo delay that shouldn't exist over open water. "It's synthetic," Bridget said quietly, almost afraid to confirm it. "Deepfake, but not crude." This was generational, multi-layered AI manipulation using live maritime tracking data to anchor the illusion. Within hours, protests had erupted outside U.S. embassies in Ankara. Turkish media demanded accountability. Russian state channels amplified outrage with surgical precision. A single video, and alliances trembled. "Source?" Catherine asked. Bridget zoomed into metadata fragments hidden beneath compression artifacts. Origin server hopped 12 times. Final ghost node in Kaliningrad. Not proof, but proximity. Grace crossed her arms. Rudenko. Catherine's jaw tightened. Rudenko was in custody in The Hague, awaiting tribunal proceedings. But ideological networks didn't require proximity. They required believers. "This isn't about him," Catherine said. "It's about doctrine." Vanessa had built a network that weaponized secrecy. Rudenko refined psychological destabilization. Now someone had fused both with artificial intelligence. The next evolution. "Get me the raw maritime telemetry," Catherine ordered. "Not the public feed, the encrypted fleet channel." Minutes later, classified ship logs populated the screen. USS Farragut had been 112 nautical miles away from the alleged incident zone. The Turkish vessel in the video. It hadn't left port that day. Grace exhaled slowly, so the fire never happened. "No," Catherine said, "but the anger did." That was the battlefield now. Perception. If they disproved the video too slowly, damage would calcify into belief. Catherine grabbed her jacket. "Where are we going?" Bridget asked. "Naples," Catherine replied, 6th Fleet Command. The Mediterranean air carried salt and tension in equal measure. Inside the U.S. Naval Support Activity Headquarters, admirals argued in clipped tones while diplomatic cables flooded secure inboxes. NATO emergency consultations were already being scheduled. Catherine entered the briefing room without ceremony. "We have 6 hours," she said calmly. "After that, narratives solidify." An American Rear Admiral frowned. "With respect, Agent Sullivan, this is a diplomatic issue." "It's an informational attack," she corrected, "and you're losing." Grace connected Bridget's live feed onto the room's main display. Frame analysis, shadow discrepancies, AI rendering inconsistencies invisible to the naked eye but glaring under forensic review. "We release this," the Admiral said. Catherine shook her head. "If you release raw analysis, it looks defensive. It feeds conspiracy." "So what do you suggest?" She stepped closer to the screen. "We don't just debunk it, we expose the architecture behind it." Silence fell. That meant revealing classified AI detection capabilities. Risky. But hesitation was worse. An hour later, Sentinel initiated Operation Lighthouse. Instead of a press denial, They coordinated simultaneous transparency releases across 5 NATO nations. Not just statements. Proof. Behind-the-scenes forensic breakdown videos. Turkish naval telemetry confirming their ship never sailed. Independent European AI labs validating synthetic markers. Even social media platforms were looped in with coordinated takedown flags. The key wasn't volume. It was synchronization. Truth hitting globally at the same time the lie had. Within 4 hours, the narrative shifted. Anger cooled into skepticism. Protests thinned. Russian amplifiers pivoted to claiming Western censorship, but momentum had stalled. Grace leaned back in her chair, inside the Naples operations room. "That was too clean," she muttered. Catherine agreed. "Because sophisticated attacks test defenses." This felt like calibration. A probe. Bridget's voice crackled through secure comms from Virginia. "Catherine, you need to see this." A second video surfaced. This one more personal. Grainy bodycam footage from Syria 3 years ago. Her mission. Her team. The 8 SEALs who died. The clip showed Catherine giving an order that, if real, would imply she knowingly led them into an ambush. It was flawless. Her voice, her posture, even the scar near her left temple visible beneath desert sun. Grace looked at her carefully. "Catherine." She didn't flinch. "It's fake," she said evenly. But she felt the hit internally. This wasn't geopolitical destabilization. This was targeted erosion. If released publicly, it would reignite internal investigations. Destroy her credibility. Cripple Sentinel. "Source?" she asked quietly. "Same ghost routing," Bridget replied, but this one seated in veteran forums, emotional territory. Strategic. Undermine the Guardian. Then discredit the defense. Catherine walked out onto the balcony overlooking the harbor. Warships rested against golden Mediterranean light. She closed her eyes for a brief second. Vanessa once told her, "You are the weapon I built." Maybe that had been partially true. Because whoever orchestrated this knew exactly where to strike. Not her body. Her doubt. Grace joined her outside. "You don't have to prove yourself again," Grace said softly. Catherine's gaze stayed on the water. "It's not about me," she replied. "If they can rewrite history with pixels, they can erase accountability anywhere." Grace nodded once. "So we burn it down." Catherine turned back inside. "No," she said calmly, "we illuminate it." Instead of suppressing the Syria deepfake, Catherine made a controversial choice. She requested the original classified mission footage be partially declassified. Redacted, but enough to establish timeline authenticity. Admirals resisted. Lawyers objected. But Catherine stood firm. "If we hide behind secrecy, we validate suspicion." 48 tense hours later, the Department of Defense authorized a controlled release. The authentic footage showed chaos, confusion, and Catherine fighting to extract her team after intelligence failed, not leading them into betrayal. Military analysts publicly confirmed discrepancies between real and synthetic clips. Veterans who had once doubted her began posting support. Not because she defended herself, because she chose transparency. The deepfake lost traction. Its architects lost leverage. But Catherine knew something sobering. This wasn't a single adversary. It was an ecosystem. AI manipulation accessible to anyone with funding and intent. Sentinel expanded overnight. Not in manpower. In mandate. Partnerships with tech firms. Joint AI detection research. Psychological resilience training for diplomats and officers. If future wars were fought in perception, they needed armor for the mind. Late that evening, alone in her temporary quarters, Catherine replayed the synthetic Syria clip one last time. The fake version of herself stared back, calmly issuing a fatal order. It was unsettling how convincing it felt. She powered it off. Truth required vigilance now, not just courage. Her secure phone vibrated. Unknown number. She answered. Silence for 3 seconds. Then a voice she hadn't heard since Arlington. Vanessa Blackwood. You handled that elegantly, Vanessa said from a monitored prison line. Catherine didn't react. You're adapting faster than I expected, Vanessa continued. But understand something, this isn't about nations anymore. It's about belief systems. You don't get to lecture me from a cage, Catherine replied evenly. Vanessa's faint laugh carried through static. Cages are relative. Click. The line went dead. Catherine stared at the phone. Vanessa wasn't directing operations, but she was watching outcomes, measuring evolution. Catherine stepped to the window again. Naples' lights shimmered against dark water. Somewhere, unseen operators were already drafting the next illusion, the next fracture point. But Sentinel wasn't chasing shadows blindly anymore. They were studying patterns, anticipating adaptation. Strength had once meant pulling a trigger faster. Now it meant thinking faster than deception. Catherine rested her hands against the cool glass. They wanted to rewrite her story. Rewrite alliances. Rewrite reality. But truth, when defended properly, doesn't disappear. It sharpens. And this time, she was ready before the lie even formed. What do you do when the lie isn't meant to divide nations, but to start a war between superpowers? 1 year after Arlington, Sentinel intercepted a signal that wasn't loud. It was precise. Bridget caught it first. An encrypted data packet disguised as atmospheric research telemetry transmitted from a decommissioned weather buoy in the North Pacific. The packet contained launch trajectory simulations. Not generic ones. Specific coordinates. Seattle, Vancouver, San Francisco. 3 cities. 3 arcs. One terrifying implication. Simulated ICBM flight paths originating from a U.S. Ohio-class submarine. Grace stared at the screen. That's not propaganda, she whispered. That's escalation modeling. Catherine's mind moved fast. This wasn't deepfake footage. This was something more dangerous. False flag preparation. If someone could inject fabricated launch telemetry into early warning systems, just long enough to trigger retaliatory panic, nuclear doctrine would do the rest. Who has access to submarine telemetry architecture? Catherine asked. Bridget swallowed. Only a handful of cleared contractors and SDRATCOM cyber liaisons. The room fell silent, because that meant infiltration at the highest tier. This isn't about convincing the public, Catherine said slowly. It's about convincing machines. They were airborne within hours, headed toward Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, home of U.S. Strategic Command. Snow swept across the runway as Sentinel's jet landed under heavy clearance protocols. Inside the hardened command facility, the air felt different. Heavier. Walls lined with live global missile tracking systems. Generals who never raised their voices because they never needed to. Catherine stood before a digital globe glowing with strategic overlays. If this simulation is injected during a high-tension window, she explained, automated defensive protocols could misinterpret it as live launch telemetry. A 2-minute window. That's all it would take. Not to fire missiles automatically, but to elevate threat levels fast enough that human judgment becomes compressed. And compressed judgment makes mistakes. The STRATCOM cyber chief, General Markridge, studied her carefully. You're suggesting someone intends to trigger near-launch conditions between nuclear powers. I'm suggesting, Catherine replied evenly, that someone wants us to believe we're under attack. Grace folded her arms. And the best time to do that, she asked. Bridget answered. During a real-world crisis. As if summoned by prophecy, a staff officer entered hurriedly. Sir, breaking development. Naval skirmish reported in the South China Sea. Chinese state media claiming aggressive U.S. maneuver. Catherine felt her pulse slow instead of spike. There it is. Crisis layered over simulation. The architecture was elegant. While diplomats scramble over a maritime confrontation, early warning systems receive corrupted data implying submarine launches. Confusion multiplies. Trust fractures. And in nuclear strategy, perception equals reality. Where's the buoy signal now? Catherine asked. Bridget's fingers flew across a secure terminal. It's gone dark. Not reassuring. It meant the test transmission was complete. The real one would come later. 3 days passed in relentless analysis. Sentinel integrated directly into STRATCOM cyber defense, an unprecedented level of access. Catherine barely slept. She studied submarine telemetry architecture until the lines blurred. Ohio-class submarines operated on isolated networks, physically segmented, air-gapped, but external simulation injection wouldn't require direct submarine compromise. Only infiltration at the early warning interpretation layer. Feed false trajectory data upstream. Not from the weapon, from the sensor. Brilliant. Terrifying. Grace entered the secure ops bay holding fresh intel. Chinese military cyber units are reporting anomalies too, she said quietly. Catherine looked up. They're seeing phantom U.S. launches. Grace nodded. It's symmetrical, which meant neither side was the origin. Both were targets. That changed everything. This wasn't East versus West. It was chaos versus stability. Bridget's voice cut through the room. Catherine, new signal, same buoy signature, but this time it's piggybacking onto commercial satellite bandwidth. Live window approaching. Catherine stepped to the main console. General, she said calmly to Markridge, we need to temporarily decouple automated trajectory validation from sensor input. He hesitated. That risks blinding us. It risks preventing accidental escalation, she countered. 2 seconds. 3. In nuclear command centers, seconds feel like eternity. Do it, Markridge ordered. Technicians moved instantly. Outside, somewhere in the Pacific, the rogue signal activated. Inside STRATCOM, red indicators flickered across screens. Simulated arcs appeared: Seattle, Vancouver, San Francisco. For half a second, alarms began to trigger. Then the decoupling override engaged. Instead of escalating to threat condition red, the system flagged the data as unverified simulation. Contained. No retaliatory posturing. No elevated launch readiness. The Phantom missiles died as code on a screen. Silence settled like dust after a storm. Grace exhaled slowly. That was it, she murmured. Catherine didn't celebrate. Because someone had just tested the threshold of nuclear panic. Tracing the signal took 48 more hours. The origin wasn't Russia. Wasn't China. Wasn't even a nation-state. It was a private military AI consortium operating out of a free trade tech zone in Southeast Asia, publicly contracted for defensive modeling. Privately funded by a web of shell corporations tied to energy market manipulators. War, or the perception of imminent war, spikes oil prices. Markets react before missiles fly. Profit in panic. Catherine stared at the financial analysis Bridget compiled. They were going to short the market, Bridget said, stunned. Trigger near-launch hysteria, then cash in before de-escalation. Grace shook her head slowly. They almost gambled with nuclear annihilation for quarterly earnings. Catherine felt something colder than anger settle in her chest. Vanessa had believed in ideology. Rudenko believed in psychological warfare. These operators believed in volatility. Different motives. Same weaponization of trust. International arrest warrants were issued within days. The consortium servers seized. Executives detained. Publicly, the incident was framed as a cyber anomaly resolved through joint monitoring. Privately, it was classified as the closest synthetic escalation event in modern history. Late that night, alone inside the STRATCOM observation deck, Catherine stood before the glowing digital globe. Cities pulsed with quiet light. Millions sleeping, unaware how close automated systems had come to misinterpreting fiction as attack. Grace joined her silently. "You okay?" she asked. Catherine nodded slowly. "They didn't want to start a war," she said. "They just wanted the fear of one." Grace leaned against the railing. "That's worse. Because fear spreads faster than fallout." Bridget entered moments later, holding her tablet. "You're not going to like this." Catherine turned. "The code architecture used in the buoy signal," Bridget continued. "It mirrors fragments of ghost directive encryption." Vanessa again. "Not directly. But her doctrine. Her legacy had evolved beyond espionage into destabilization economics." Catherine felt the weight of it. "You are the weapon I built." "Maybe. But weapons can change allegiance." Sentinel wasn't just countering attacks anymore. They were redefining deterrence for the information age. Transparency over secrecy. Verification over reaction. Human judgment over automated panic. As dawn broke over Nebraska, pale light filtering through reinforced glass, Catherine finally allowed herself one quiet thought. Strength used to mean firepower. Now it meant restraint. Restraint is harder. Restraint requires clarity when alarms scream. And tonight, because of that restraint, 3 cities would wake to ordinary mornings. Coffee brewing. Traffic humming. Children heading to school. Unaware that phantom missile had briefly traced arcs above their sleeping skis. Catherine watched the globe spin slowly. The battlefield had changed again. Not trenches. Not drones. Not even deepfakes. But algorithms capable of ending civilization if trusted blindly. She rested her hand lightly against the cool surface of the display. "They wanted to see if we'd flinch," Grace said quietly. Catherine's eyes remained steady. "Then we don't flinch. Because sometimes the most powerful act in the world is choosing not to push the button."